So I've made both of those pieces of piping. Now you might notice I've got these thread ends left long. Now the reason I do that, I don't ever use the automatic thread cutter. It's just that then I can use this tail to pull the thread from behind the back, and it just stops everything going down the needle plate. Now I'm just going to trim back that seam allowance all along there to 1/4 of an inch. Oh, and by the way, I'm going to do that with the rotary cutter. And I have to apologise that I often forget. I waft between metric and imperial just because over the years I've done mostly 1/4 of an inch for patchwork, 1/4 of an inch seams for lingerie, but then I often do 6mm now for lingerie as well. And the other thing is that because I've been doing this a long time, I just actually eyeball the 1/4 of an inch trim on this. It actually doesn't matter because it's underwear, it's not bra. So if it's a mil either way, it's not so much of a big deal, but you can measure that 6mm all along there with a ruler. Now, before I attach the piping to the side of that center panel, I'm actually going to now just attach a lining to cover this stitching that we had here. So I'm attaching a lining again from a stable fabric to this center front panel. I'm going to pin that and then hand base the edges and then come back for when we attach the piping. So you can see here I've hand basted all of the back to the lining to the center front panel. I've pinned the piping down either side, and now again using that zipper foot with the needle offset right to the left, I'm going to stitch the piping to the front. So you can see I've stitched that piping there to the sides, and next I'm going to attach the side fronts, but because I'm using a couple of different colours ways here, I'm actually going to do the front gusset first while I've got the red stitched. So I've already cut out the gusset, the main fabric, but for the lining, just to mention, I usually buy 1 metre at a time of bamboo lycra. I just think it's softer for the gusset, an organic bamboo lycra. And then what I do is I wash the whole lot and put it away. I actually got this bamboo lycra from Helen at Nellie Jones, so I'm just going to cut out that lining now and attach the gusset. So we're doing an enclosed seam for the gusset. So first of all, I've put right sides together, the main fabric to the center front, and then the right side that you want to be facing out of the gusset is attached to the wrong side of the center front. So then you've got this gusset, the gusset with the center front sandwiched in between. Easiest to stitch from this side using a straight stitch. Find always, no matter what I do, these little ends end up getting caught and I have to fix them up a little bit. For the first time ever, it didn't catch. Now I'm just going to knot those seams off just so that they don't come undone before later, but I haven't done a forward back forward. I also don't trim and grade this seam anymore because I don't think it makes a difference, and also I don't want to reduce the integrity of the seam. So we're going to come back and attach that to the back later. So we're going to iron this flat, and because we're going to iron that flat and come back to it and add the side fronts, and then we're going to move towards the back. So next I've pinned the side seams there, and now I'm quite decide whether to do, I think it is going to be better in gold there because this is going to face that way, so I think it's better that the gold is showing. So I'm going to change the gold thread, and we're going to stitch that again using the piping foot with it butted right up against the seam there. Sometimes I have to actually go over it a second time if I'm not quite close enough. Now for this particular pair, as I might have said, I was really hoping to go with a red or a gold satin for the back, or I even thought about a blue, but none of them had the right stretch percentage. So I'm actually going with a mesh because it's got enough stretch for both to make up the fact that the fronts haven't got this full stretch, and also this needs to have stretch in both directions. Oh, and sorry, the reason I altered my order in the video there, I was just trying to check before I stitched this that I was going to stay with a gold thread. So while I've got those pieces aligned there, I'm actually going to pin the back while it's there, because it's just easier, otherwise it's be like a movable feast. The other thing that's lovely about this particular mesh, it's actually a colour called champagne, so it's got a slight pinkish hue which is going to combine well with this red. So I'm going to pin along here at a 1/4 inch seam, and using a stretch stitch. So I usually use a standard zigzag, 1 wide and 2 long, and then I'm going to come along the edge and neaten that with a zigzag, standard zigzag 3 wide and 1.5 long. Now you could, after you've done the securing the stitch, you could use an overlocker, but I just find that a standard zigzag is fine, and I don't want to have to try and change my overlocker threads again. So I'm going to stitch that, then change the presser foot and come back and stitch this. So hopefully you can see this. I've got that 1/4 inch seam, and then that's a standard zigzag, 1 wide and 2 long. Then I've got a cross overcast here to neaten. I've done 1 row, then another row of standard zigzag, 3 wide and 1.5 long. And now I've changed the presser foot, and I'm going to come back and stitch this seam here. So you can see I've stitched both of those all along, but I'm just, at some points it's not quite hugging, you can see that there. So I'm just going to go back and do a second row. I think you know I'm super fussy. Then after I've done that, I'm just going to neaten this a bit and then stitch across there with a standard zigzag, 3.5, 1.5 long. I've thought so many times about different ways of doing this. You know, I've even thought about putting a beautiful satin binding over there, but I don't know, I've just kept it that, I've just always done it as a zigzag, and that's the way I've done them, and maybe not very couture-ish. I think I'll have to think about, maybe you could, as I said, put a satin bind over there if you want. And when I meant trim to neaten, I just meant trim the edges so they're the same length. I didn't mean to shorten that seam allowance. And now I'm going to do the zigzag 3 wide and 1.5 long across the edge. So I've done 2 rows of 3 wide and 1.5 long narrow zigzag, standard zigzag over the top there, and I usually iron that so that the seam is, so that the seam is, actually it doesn't matter. Next, to attach the back gusset, we're going to mark with a pin the centre of the back gusset and the back gusset lining, and we're going to put right sides together, the back to the back, and pinning at the side there, then pin the side there each side and move through the centre. So I've pinned that so that the back is going to sit like that. Now next we want this gusset is going to be like that. So the easiest way I find to do this is to start by turning it the way it would be. So turning that part to there and pinning that one. And that center one, the same, is going to go the center to there, because we're going to, this is what's called burrito method, but it's an enclosed seam, is the other way of saying it. So we're going to pin that center to there, and remove the one from there, and then all the way to the end. There. And replace those pins. And I'm trying really hard not to suck through my teeth, because apparently that's what I do sometimes when I'm concentrating, which can be annoying for some people. So I've nearly finished pinning that across again, pulling that pin out. Be careful to take all the pins out from behind, because otherwise when you stitch it, you'll break a needle. I've been caught there before too. Again, so you can see that pin comes out from there. Now that's ready to stitch, but having said all of that, just like with, as I said before, I do find it's much easier to stitch from the woven side. If you stitch it from this lycra side, it all bunches up. So I'm replacing those pins. Then I'm going to stitch all along here with a 1/4 inch seam using a straight stitch. And as I said, I actually don't back forward at the ends, because it's going to get captured later in the picot seam, but so I just leave the ends long, and when that folds out, you then have an enclosed seam, which I'll show you in a minute. So that seam's all finished, and then you can see when you turn this out, you've got your enclosed seam on both sides. Now, as I said, I don't trim and grade that anymore, because I don't find it makes a difference, and also because I don't want to reduce the integrity of the seam. So now what I'm going to do, again, but you don't need to, but you can do it by machine, but I find it much easier to hand baste these edges together along both sides, and then I will trim back some of the oh sorry, and I'm going to knot this off here, and then I'm just going to pin and then hand baste these edges together. And then what we're going to do is come back, pin and hand baste those edges together. And then what we're going to come back and do is attach the elastic all around the edges, the leg edges here. Okay, so I'm just going to hand baste all that. I actually don't usually trim this, because I don't want to reduce the integrity of the seam. So I'm just going to attach the picot, and I'll show you how I do that. But I do just knot this again off here, like I have done here. Just knot that. So that it's secure, and then I can just cut that to get it out of the way. Okay, so I'll come back to you when I've got all of this together, ready to do the picot elastic. And actually, sorry, this should be sitting a little bit more across like that, but you'll see that when I've finished. Not always quick under the camera. Well, it's not, I probably should just do it and then show you. Anyway, I'm going to come back when I've got all that basted together. So for attaching the picot elastic, we start pinning with the picots out, with the soft fluffy side that's going against the skin, as compared to this side, which isn't quite as fluffy. Then pin, stretching slightly around this hip curve here. Only very slightly around that hip curve. This bit here will be reasonably straight, not very stretchy, because it's a straight section. Now, when we get to this, whichever way you want these seams to go, it really is the way it tends to want to fall, but make sure they match on each side and here and at the top. But the other thing we've got to consider now is that we've got to get rid of the cord here. So cut that there and pull, grab the cord here and pull that through. Now the seam is actually 1/4 inch, but when you pull it, so I usually just go about that much. I can't explain how much that is, but it's about 1.2. So it's about double what you think it is for that allowance, because it actually retracts a lot back. So that once I've done that, the actual cord is coming to there, which is about where I want it to be, so that you've reduced that bulk, so that when it turns out, you haven't got, the cord is up higher up. When you get to this section here, that's quite an exaggerated curve. So we're going to go around in a more exaggerated manner for that curve around the front there, just before we come up to the gusset. So that's going to be quite an exaggerated stretch. And you can see I haven't trimmed back that behind there because I didn't want to reduce the integrity until I'd finished. But you can see where I'm going with that. So reducing the stretch here, not quite as much. Oh gosh, my hands are dry again. It's winter here. And I put hand cream on and cotton gloves at night, and it still gets, anyway. That, keep going. And then start stretching a bit more when we get to this back curve here. Then I'm going to continue to pin just a slight stretch, sorry, a moderate stretch around that butt cheek. It's a matter of just getting to kind of get a feel for it, but that's a moderate stretch around the butt cheek. I can't think of another word. A moderate stretch around the butt cheek. And then just a very slight cheek stretch to the end. So now that that's all pinned, we're going to use a standard zigzag, 3 wide, 1.5 long, and stitch up against where the picot finishes there, that decorative picot, all around the edges. And then I'm going to come back to how we're going to trim the seam allowance. So now that's all done, ready to be sewn back. But first of all, we're going to, with the duckbill scissors, we're going to trim back the seam allowance. So we'll start at one end. Oh, by the way, I do it this way because before I stitch the side seams, because then this elastic can be stitched into the side seam so you don't have the join. And then we're just going to run along and remove the seam allowance from behind here. Now I was just thinking, with this back seam here in the mesh, it actually would have been much better to have done a French seam. A bit too late now, but just for future. So next I've just been going along and finger pressing this down, because if you use the iron, it just just creates an edge. It's not great. So, and then I'm going to stitch this all along using a 3-step zigzag 1.4 wide and 1.3, 1.4 long. It's a little bit tricky to get this to fold back and not create bulk. You just have to kind of do the best you can. So finish that seam and come back to you. Next we're going to pin and stitch the side seam, and you want to make sure that you're catching the elastic so it's even at the end there. So that seam gets stitched again with a narrow standard zigzag, narrow, 1 wide, 2 long. I've done a forward back forward at the end there, but I'm also going to knot that off and stitch that. Next this is going to sit back like that. So I'm going to trim that here. Then I'm just going to trim, just to even it. We don't want to reduce the seam, but just to even it. And then I'm going to overcast this with zigzag 3 wide, 1.5 long. So that's, I've done 2 rows of that zigzag overcast. And then what I want to do is just to hold this seam back here, and also prevents the elastic from shredding. It's a bit hard to explain, but it is inclined, because you've got a cut seam there, it's inclined to shred. So what I'm going to do is stitch just with a straight stitch up through there, forward, back, forward 3 times, and then pull the threads through. And don't forget, it's best if you can put a step height behind the needle plate there. So now that that's stitched, I'm actually going to now just pull the threads through on the back. Knot those off and tie them, and that just holds that stitch flat at the back there. I really, really love how these look, by the way. They're so pretty. Anyway, so we're going to now do the top fold over elastic. So first of all, you want to start pinning the fold over elastic with the fold just at the edge of the top edge. Now, normally I will have the seam at the back here, but because I'm doing this in mesh, it's going to be harder. So I'm actually going to put the seam this side of the side back instead of that side. Now this fold over doesn't get pulled very tight, so just slightly. And when we get to this section here, like we did, you cut off the piping here and then pulled the cord out. Now this seam is a 10mm seam, so you're going to actually pull that the piping cord. I'll show you when I get to the other edge. You need to make sure you've got the lace edge matching here and here too. And then when we get to this part here, like I said, I'm going to cut that edge, but then we're going to pull this up, and that needs to be about 15mm or 1.5, because the seam allowance itself is 10, and then you've got to allow for it to retract, which is what I've done there. And also when you pin that, make sure it's turned the same way. So this one is with the red towards the yellow, so this is the same. This there, the red, oops, sorry, the red has to be towards the yellow, so the that seam allowance is towards the yellow side, so that they match, mainly so it doesn't twist when you're wearing it. And I'll just check I've got that one, yes. Then you're pinning the side seams towards the back, the centre back seam the same way as you had at the gusset. And then when you get back around to here, you're going to have about that much overlap. I don't know, about 3/4 of an inch. So that's how we know where that seam has to be. So now I know where that seam is. I've put a mark there and a mark there, because that has to be stitched so that the seam is going to be sandwiched underneath. So we're going to stitch here now, across here with a straight stitch. Okay, so we're just going to stitch across that with a straight stitch. So now that I've done that, the next thing we want to do is take this seam to about about 6-8 mil. We need to trim back each side here. And then in the center, because that we want to reduce the bulk there so that when it's folded out, oops, you get the drift. We'll try the other side. And that means then this is going to get attached up there and stitched. We're going to do our standard stitch along here now with a standard zigzag, 3 wide and 1.5 long. And then when this folds out for that, next there's less bulk at that seam, but I'll get back to you. So we're going to stitch a standard zigzag, 3 wide and 1.5 long. And I did just remember to put the label in the back, but perhaps a little bit late, so it's a bit high up. But anyway, so next we want to trim back the seam allowance behind here. Trimming to reduce the bulk. So now I've pinned that. I only need to pin at the start, and I'll start behind here using a 3-step zigzag, 5 wide, 1.5 long. Now this does end up bulky, which is why I usually like to hide it at the back there, but as I said, it wasn't going to work well over here, so I'm going to do that now. And that will, so we'll start there, stitch all around the back, and then come back and overlap it just there. Yeah, so that's done. I can never get that perfect, but so these are gorgeous. I love them. I won't put them on the model because they're not going to fit on the model. So yeah, but they're just divine. Okay, so I hope that helped. I guess next I probably should do a YouTube video on how to do the little bows and things like that. But that's all done. Perhaps let me know in the comments if there's other things you might like to learn. I thought I might do a video about wires next on YouTube, but then also we could do, as I said, we could do something about the little rouleau bows. Yeah. Thank you for following.